All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to tackle a huge question, one that might totally change how you think about heaven. You know, the idea that when we get to the afterlife, all our cultures, our nationalities, they just kind of disappear? Well, what if the answer is a big no? What if the future is way more vibrant and diverse than we've imagined?
Okay, so let's just start with this verse right here from Revelation. It's talking about the New Jerusalem, right? But listen closely to the words it uses. It says, nations will walk by its light, and that their kings will bring their unique glory into the city. I mean, that doesn't sound like some bland celestial melting pot where everyone becomes the same. It sounds like diversity is not only preserved, it's celebrated.
And right away, that just leads to this huge question. If you've always thought of eternity as, the end of all the things that divide us here on Earth, this whole idea is, well, it's kind of jarring, right? So what could it possibly mean for nations to still be a thing in a perfected world? Let's dig in and unpack that. Okay, so first things first. We might need to adjust our mental picture of the New Jerusalem. The idea here is that it's not some static, finished place. It's described with gates that are always open, with this constant call to come. You see? That suggests an ongoing process, a process of healing for the world. And if the world is still being healed, well, that means the healing of nations is definitely still on the agenda. All right, so if we're going to talk about healing a nation, we first have to figure out what even is a nation in this context. And I'll give you a little spoiler alert. It's not really about political borders or governments, not in the way you might think. It's interesting. The book of Revelation has this four-part way of describing all of humanity: tongues, tribes, peoples, and nations. And these different words seem to line up with different eras of history. But look at the one that's listed first, the one that corresponds to the time right after the Tower of Babel. It's tongues, language. And that right there is our biggest clue. So that brings us to the core definition we're working with here. A nation isn't just a political thing. At its heart, it's a linguistic thing. It's a group of people who have the same language. And because of that, they fundamentally think the same way. They categorize the world in similar ways. They share a basic view of reality. So, why is language so important, so foundational? Well, it's because it's so much more than just a tool for talking. Every single language has its own web of connections, its own unique grammar, its own way of basically slicing up the reality we see. It gives people a distinct perspective, a shared culture. Heck, it even creates subcultures through dialects. Just think about the differences between American and British English. It's the same basic language, but boy, do they have different cultural flavors. Okay, to really get a handle on this, we've got to look at two huge events in the Bible that basically frame this whole story of language: the Tower of Babel and the Day of Pentecost.
Now here's where it gets really fascinating. There's this interpretation that when the Bible says the people at Babel had one lip, it doesn't just mean they all spoke one language. That word lip can also mean a unified religious belief. In this case, a false, idolatrous one. And that totally reframes what was happening, right? Their rebellion wasn't just about building a tall tower. It was theological. They were trying to build a whole world system that didn't need God.
So just look at this contrast. It's incredible. What God did at Babel wasn't just random chaos. It was about shattering a false religious unity. And then Pentecost comes along, and it's the perfect reversal. But notice, it doesn't get rid of all the different languages and make everyone speak one language again. No! It unites them by speaking the one true faith through all those different languages. And this is really the crucial takeaway. Pentecost reverses the religious curse of Babel, but it actually affirms, it redeems the linguistic diversity that happened. The message couldn't be clearer. All this cultural and linguistic variety isn't some problem that needs to be fixed. It's a good thing. It's part of the plan. Every single language is now a worthy vehicle for God's truth. But this idea that God is all about diversity, it goes even deeper. It actually starts to change how we see language itself, and maybe even what it means to be human. Okay, think about this. God is revealed in the Bible as a Trinity, right? And part of how that's described is through the language of, language. The Son is called the Word. The Spirit is the breath or wind that carries that word. So if we are made in God's image, then our ability to speak, to use language, that has to be a core part of how we reflect who God is. We are, you could say, living words ourselves. And this just brings us to this beautiful core idea. If our language is part of God's image in us, then having a diversity of languages isn't a bug, it's a feature. You can think of it like a diamond.
Each language is just a different facet, catching the light and reflecting God's image from a totally unique angle.
So if you follow that logic, if God's image is in individuals and it's in families, then it makes sense that it's also reflected in this even bigger group, the nation. And remember, we're defining a nation as a linguistic and cultural group. And if that's true, it means God's plan isn't just about pulling individuals out of their cultures to save them. It's about saving and redeeming those nations, those cultures, as they are.
Okay, so what does this all mean for something like Christian missions? If God's plan is to save entire nations as nations, then the goal can't be to just erase their culture. It has to be about transforming that culture from the inside out.
And the source material for this really points us back to the Great Commission. Think about the command Jesus gave. He didn't just say, go disciple a bunch of individuals, or go disciple the world in some vague way. The words are very specific. Disciple all nations. It acknowledges that these groups, these nations, have their own distinct corporate identities.
So, what does that actually look like on the ground? Well, it's a process, right? It starts with the Word, the Bible, being introduced into a culture and its own language. Then, over time, maybe generations, the ideas in that word start to seep into the language itself, reshaping how people think. And then finally, you get this incredible flowering of culture, where that nation starts to create its own unique Christian art and music and literature, not just borrowing it from another culture.
And this is so important because it highlights a huge risk in missions, which is basically cultural colonization. The source gives this really powerful example: Korean Christians singing American gospel songs that have just been translated. Now, there's nothing wrong with the songs, but it kind of misses the whole point. The real goal would be to see Korean culture produce its own beautiful hymns, ones that come right out of the Korean language and the Korean soul.
And this really leaves us with a final, pretty deep question to think about. The source material talks about how cultures have these deep-seated habits, ways of being and thinking that get passed down for centuries. So if that's true, what does it really mean to heal a nation? It's got to be more than just individual people making a decision. It's about a deep, generational healing of an entire people's collective identity. What would that even look like? Now that is something to chew on.